Hello everyone, welcome back for another day of FDG TV. I'm Tommy Thompson. That's Anne Sullivan. How you doing, Anne?
I'm good. And that's Kaylee, who's joining us again for another day of FDG TV.
It's a shame because we just had Zoe appear.
We did.
Pre-show.
She might make an appearance because she is actually on the desk. So
okay.
She might come join us later.
All right. I won't say her name anymore just in case he wants to come in then and subsequently steal the spotlight.
Fair enough.
But yeah, so today is the last day of FDG 2022. So we're going to look back on the conference a little. And then also going to we're actually going to have more guests coming in talking about some of the papers they presented. Of course, another episode of Best Paper Watch. And hopefully you're getting ready to either head home or conduct some further travel. Or actually, if you participated in the conference remotely, you've just logged off and are chilling out. Or you went back to bed or whatever it is because time zones are a nightmare. For yourself, and because you're always running a little behind us, we're always awake and lucid while we're trying to do preparation for this show, and then we get a message from yourself like, what's going on?
Yes, I wake up and it's just a bunch of messages, and I'm like, what emergency is there this morning that I have to worry about?
When's the show?
The good news is, what is it? The good news is that you all figure it out before I even, get out of bed. So I appreciate that.
But also you're doing a lot of prep late in the night, because I often wake up and find that yourself and Mike are chatting a lot in our Discord while I'm sound asleep. So I wake up like, find out a whole thing went on.
Well, I figured out how to pronounce that.
There was actually a discussion, I think, about specifically of pronouncing the word Pokemon.
Yes. Which
I probably butchered that anyway, but never mind. So yeah, I guess looking back on the week, and what's been your highlights of FDG 2022? What's been your favorite parts of the conference?
Oh, I mean, I think definitely my favorite was obviously that was the best, but for me,
awesome,
how about you, Tommy?
I wanted to make sure I picked out something that wasn't the same as what you picked, but certainly. And yeah, that was definitely, I think, my highlight moment.
I agree. I think most everyone would agree with that too.
As a reminder for everyone who's watching us when this episode airs, we of course do pre-record this episode of FDG TV prior to it airing. So if you are watching us and reacting in the live chat, those of us who are in the chat, we're not reacting to you directly from what's happening in the video. So if we do actually do something in response to what you said, you're just lucky. Well done.
We read your mind from the future, from the past.
One of them, right. Both of them.
Moving on.
Alrighty, let's get started. We've got two guests today talking about two papers, and of course we're going to have Best Paper Watches. So let's get into our very first guest segment. So today we're going to be chatting with Kocurek, who's a professor of digital humanities and media studies at Illinois Institute of Technology, and we're going to be looking specifically at a paper called Sparklier Worlds, Understanding Games for Girls as Style Intervention, which happened yesterday, bearing in mind in the order in which we record all this. So please give a warm welcome to Carly. And the obligatory applause, which you don't hear, but we're putting it in there, don't you worry.
Excellent.
So yeah, just to kind of paint the picture really about what this paper was about, it's your work was looking at the first movement in the 90s around computer games for girls, and specifically the use of how CD-ROM influenced gameplay experiences. And so the paper itself discusses a lot of themes, design decisions, and how they came about for this movement to really flourish. And I figured it would be great, Carly, if you could maybe paint the picture for us a little bit on what the gaming market looked like around the time of this research, and subsequently what led you to looking into this particular body of work.
Sure. So a lot of things happen in the U.S. games industry, and I'm going to focus specifically on the U.S. here because that's the context I work in. My background's in American studies. And also there are things that happen kind of like economically, culturally, media market-wise that are pretty specific. So there's a major crash in the games industry in the early 1980s. And what that enables is this like pivot away from arcades and towards console systems, right? That's also what enables like Nintendo to really kind of come to be a major player in the US market. And part of what happens with that is the companies become very risk averse. So you had this kind of like wide open startup environment where it's like, maybe we could do this. And they're like, yeah, sure, do that. Right. And you go away from that. And my favorite analogy was that someone said one time, it's like there was a hose of money and you just had to jump in front of it and you would get funding for your projects. Right. And like, that's over. The bubble bursts, it's over. So companies become very conservative about kind of how they think about their audiences. And so by the early 90s, the sales figures are that the industry is like, and it depends whose numbers you pull, right? But like 75 to 90% dominated by a demographic of boys and young men, right? That's like, and it ages up, right? It starts, it's like, oh, it's, 12 to 20. Well, now it's 15 to 22, right? Like it just kind of, but they're not expanding, right? And so you have this serious red ocean situation where all the companies are trying to undercut each other, which, that happens, but it also means like, it's very weird to fight over scraps in one market when you could be looking at other markets. So that's part of what's happening. And the ads get really like kind of like aggressive, like even Nintendo that people think of as like the more wholesome company, like tons of the Game Boy ads when it first comes out are like masturbation jokes, which is like, I don't know, like that seems like a little at odds with how people think about Nintendo, right? So it's just a really strange time. Simultaneously to that, you actually start having a lot of women that have worked in the industry for like 10, 15 years by this point, right? And so they have the kinds of connections pull it might take to try something new. So it's kind of an interesting set of circumstances. It's also interesting that this is when CD-ROM kind of like becomes viable because CD-ROM isn't thought of specifically as a video game medium, right? It's thought of as a multimedia form. And so there's a lot more flex there and a lot less kind of like narrowness and how people think about what you could do with this thing. So there's just a lot of factors. I got very interested in that. My first book's about arcades and about kind of like masculinity at arcades in the US. My second book, I did a design study really, or like kind of a study of the career of Brenda Laurel, who starts at Atari, writes an amazing book called Computers as Theater, then is an interval research, and from that spins off and starts Purple Moon, which is one of the companies here. And I got really interested in a lot of the things she was talking about, but kind of like why this failed, right? I think we do a lot of efforts to kind of diversify tech, diversify gaming, et cetera. I don't know that we always do a good job of like stopping and reflecting on what worked and what didn't. So I think this period's super interesting for that. I just wanted to know more. I also, and I know this always sounds really grim, but because I'm a historian and I do oral history, I'm always like really cognizant of whether or not people are alive. And I'm like, this is a good time to do this project because people are alive, right? That remember these decisions being made. And like, that might not be true in 20 years, or like people might just like not want to talk about it anymore. So we might miss things. And that doesn't mean I'm getting a comprehensive record of everything that happened, but it does mean I'm getting, 25, 30 really interesting oral history interviews that cover all kinds of kind of quirky things. And I think that documentation is important. It's a major part of the project, but also that kind of reflective piece is quite key as well.
Yeah, it's been really, I found it really interesting to read the paper personally, because you speak there about time and when people are coming in, but I remember these growing up. In the UK, we actually saw these in stores, but I've never heard anyone talk about it since. So from my outside perspective, I was like, oh, this is weird. I like this. This is cool. So very exciting.
Yeah. And I think when the games actually got in front of people, that was often the response, right? Like Chop Suey was huge, right? Like it's like written up in Wired. It's like in Entertainment Weekly, like just like a level of success that I think was really unusual. But I went through, I calculated this at one point, but like something like 80,000 pages of gaming magazines from the period while I was at the Strong in the archive.
Wow.
Yeah, like just like really fast, like looking for anything I could relate to this. And I found like 2 tiny write-ups about Chop Suey, and it was often written up, like at least one of them wrote it up as an educational title, which it wasn't, because they couldn't figure out where else to put it in the magazine. So like it's getting a lot of attention in like the tech press and the mainstream like entertainment press, and the games press is just like, yeah, I guess that's happening,
Wow. Yeah, it was interesting because that was kind of my formative years of game playing. And so, Seventh Guest, which was in your paper, was such a formative experience for me in gaming. And yet I actually knew very little about the games that were going on at the time that were actually meant for girls. So it was really interesting to read about all of that and think through what I hadn't gotten a chance to play. But so, your research found that there was a lot of commonalities between the types of play. So there was a lot of toy-like interaction, focus on creativity, and this desire for limited time commitments that through the research of the companies, they found that this was something that they were asking for. And, I find that that's something that I'm also drawn to, but right now I'm finding it in mobile games and casual games. So do you think that the casual games and mobile games are possibly a natural evolution of this movement?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some overlap, and you do see some real connections where if you look at, for example, Jane Jensen's work, who is, really gets her starts here online and works on several series there, most notably the Gabriel Knight series, which has a major consumer base among adult women. And then she actually goes on and works on hidden object games, right? And so she really moves into that casual market. And I think it's pretty conscious about this is actually a similar player base. They probably actually want similarly complex and interesting stories, right? Mm-hmm. Which is I think that's some of what falls out is that interest in complex and interesting stories, which some of the games for girls titles do very, very well, right? They're really emotionally rich. They're really, the worlds are really kind of thoughtful. I also think kind of another legacy, or not necessarily direct legacy, but another through thread we can see is thinking about games like Gone Home and other games that get kind of classed as walking simulators, or that kind of are telling stories about people's lives, right? Where you can play all of Gone Home in a couple hours, right? I mean, I guess if you speed ran it, you could play it in a few minutes, but I don't know why you would do that, right? But you can play that game in a finite amount of time. It's not high stakes if you need to, if you're distracted or you need to walk away from it for a few minutes. There's almost no, it's thoughtful, and there are some kind of light puzzles and things like that. It's really, really rich as a world and as a story. But nothing's going to jump out at you, and you're not having to fight monsters, right? It's a really different kind of gameplay, but it is a kind of gameplay that really resonates with adventure games, with kind of interactive story games from the CD-ROM period as well.
Right. Yeah. I won't tell you how much time I've lost to games like Shining Nikki, which are, a mobile game that's obviously meant for a very similar market. So Tommy has prepared a little bit of a game for you.
Okay.
And we're gonna talk about aesthetics. So Tommy's going to show you a screenshot of a game for girls, and then we'd like you to tell us a bit about the game and a little bit about the aesthetic.
Sure. So this is Barbie Fashion Designer. This is the interface where you design her outfits. Barbie Fashion Designer, if you're not familiar, is very cool because you would design the things and then you could actually print them out on special paper and make the clothes for your doll. And if you bought this, it came with markers and sequins and glue and glitter paint, right? It was really made to kind of highlight that making part of this. A couple things I'll point out: that purple and teal combo is so 90s. This is the Charlotte Hornets, very popular, very cool. So the colors there. You also have a limited number of choices, and this is something Jessica Durchin talked about extensively. That you'd think the girls wanted infinite choices, but that actually becomes unappealing. It's overwhelming and not interesting. They also found girls would make really similar outfits over and over, but would see them as completely different because the use case they imagined, or the story around the outfit, was different, and that made it different. But I love that they figured that out about the choices, because that's actually, in the past 15 years, all the decision research bears this out, right? If you give people too many choices, they're very unhappy with whatever choice they end up making, right? Another fun thing here is that one of the main goals with all the Barbie games was it starts pretty and you end pretty. So it's not a makeover, right? Barbie is already great. and then you get to make something great with Barbie, which is, I think, a little different than how people maybe think about this if they haven't spent time with it.
Ooh, let me find the next one for you. There we go.
Yes. So this one's a little more fraught. This is from Let's Talk About Me, which is a magazine style CD-ROM, highly successful, based on teen magazines. And, teen magazines at this time are rough, right? Again, you can kind of see the time period, like that kind of like warped liquid background, like very cool in 1995, right? The colors and this kind of like almost zine style, right? Like where you've got like different kinds of like textures and like it almost looks like different layers, like it was paper, but it's digital and it looks digital in a pretty self-conscious way. But this section was called Miss Hottie Body, and it has like things about like, oh, if you eat nuts, it's good for your hair because of reasons. I don't know. It actually went into it, right, in a fairly thoughtful way, right? Like the information's good, but I think, now we would look at this and be like, but I think at the time it looked pretty normal. And as someone that grew up in the 90s, like, yeah, it was like a really horrible time to live in a body. So I get why people kind of like, when I showed this one, people were always like, ooh, but I'm like, it's not great maybe, but it was like not horrible either in its context. I think this would look very, very different now. But it looks like a teen magazine, and it did really well because it looked like a teen magazine. This company actually, one of their other projects was a CD-ROM of Teen, and they got, I believe, Activision to release it. And it was one of the company's top selling titles for the year, but they were like so embarrassed about it. They wouldn't tell anyone, like they would like leave it off the list of top sellers because they were like, we're not these people, right? Like this is not what our game company does, but it was one of the ways they were making money that year for sure.
Is that like how romance novels aren't allowed on the New York Times bestseller list?
Right. Like they just like
because it would just monopolize it.
Yeah. This is from American Girl Premiere, and it's a kind of theater inspired interface. So you can see the frame, right? That's the stage, but then you're actually looking into kind of like the real home of the historical doll character, but you get to decide where her stuff goes and what she does. There's some light animations you can choose from, and you can actually make whole little stories. It's made to like let you make little animated plays or animated shows. I think this is a very good encapsulation of the American Girl brand at the time in some ways, right? Like the historical content is actually very, very, very rich. And in a way that I think people might not expect if they're not familiar with the brand, right? It's like super intense historically. It's often like actually kind of dark. Like they're dealing with things that are maybe miserable. Like I've been totally fascinated by like their more recent characters, like they're like dealing with like divorce and things like this because kids deal with these things. But yeah, this was TLC, and you can see like there's like a real overt educational component here, but there's also kind of this like playful thing where they're playing with the fact that it's a screen, it's a stage, right? And really, really looking at getting girls using technology, which is something many of these companies are doing very self-consciously, right? So there's a lot to be said about content and whether or not the content is what people would consider most optimal. Although I will say, I think we disproportionately talk about whether or not things are good for girls. We're not like, I don't know, is Sonic the Hedgehog good for boys? That seems really important to know, right? Like that would be a bizarre thing to say, but like it's said about all these all the time, right. Which I think is telling about some kind of cultural values there about who gets to play and spend time in the way they choose. But yeah, so American Girl, huge deal at the time. And of course this like feeds into Mattel becoming just kind of this like the whale that swallows everything, right? Because they acquire the Learning Company, which actually put this out a little later. They acquire Pleasant Company, which is this company. They actually acquire Purple Moon, right? Like they acquire tons and tons of these companies. And they weren't all good deals. Like the Learning Company is actually a mess at the point that they acquire it. And it's like such a mess that Mattel stops producing games for like years. Like they closed down Mattel Media. Right. It's over. And I think the folks that worked in Mattel Media were totally heartbroken because they worked in that sector and they could have told, corporate, like, don't do it. Right. Like, but, I think they were like the cute little studio over there that does things and weren't making business decisions.
Let's see. I think we've got. Is this the last one? And I can't remember how many we put in, but
You've got the slideshow.
we got one more, I think. Yes, I went away and prepared it all. Okay.
This is Chop Suey, which is very much about folk art. And Teresa Duncan and Monica Giss, who made this at Magna Interactive. Again, like very folk art, very deliberate folk art style. And so you also see these like really funny little collage elements where here you have like real photo or real video, like that kind of photorealistic thing in the hand-drawn frame, right? Really distinct looking. Also worth mentioning, David Sedaris narrates this game, kind of like a pre-fame David Sedaris. And then I think it's the drummer from Fugazi wrote the songs. Like it was someone from the DC punk scene wrote the music, and I'm blanking on who it was right this second. But lots of very cool people worked on this thing, but it looks really, really different. It looks like a storybook. It looks really, it kind of reminds me of like Pee-wee's Playhouse or something, right? Like that kind of like bricolage and combination of things.
Nice. And here we go. That's the last one we got for you.
All right. This is Mackenzie and Company, which was like much maligned. And still, when I talk to people that worked when I talk to men that worked in and around the industry at this time, they will bring this game up to be like, oh, and then they made this. But I think that's totally unfair for a host of reasons. So Mackenzie and Company is a full motion video game. Like you could think of it as an interactive movie about like a teen girl who's like popular and like drives a cool car, like going around and trying to get a boyfriend, right? Like it's like classic kind of like teen movie stuff. And I think the hostility to it is unfair for a lot of reasons. One of which is this is probably like the most market research that ever went into an indie game. Like they interviewed like 2,000 girls or something. Wow. So this was really done for a very specific audience. And I think for that specific audience, it was appealing and interesting, right? I had this hilarious thing where someone that was a software critic at the time was like really annoyed that it shipped with a lipstick. But then the one write-up I could find in a game magazine that was written by a woman was a woman ecstatic that it came with a lipstick, right? And so you see this real disconnect between like who's reviewing and who's actually like, who's it for? An interesting thing here, this is like it's American Laser Games, which spins off as Her Interactive, based partially on the success of this. But it was really an independent release. They couldn't get anyone to distribute it. They couldn't get a publisher. So they self-publish, right? So it's a very independent project from kind of an obscure company in New Mexico. They can't get any game or software departments to stock it. So they go to the makeup counters and the shoe department. They distribute through Sam and Libby Shoes. They are on makeup counters at major retailers as point of sale. So when you're up there buying your lipstick or whatever, like your 12-pack of lip smackers, this is on the counter, right? And so it was used to kind of sell at that point. They sold, I believe, 50,000 copies, which given like Barbie CD-ROM was the highest selling CD-ROM of the year it came out. It was like a shocking success at 500,000 copies. And that's somewhere that did a national television ad campaign. So 50,000 copies independently produced from a small company and self-distributed is like stunning.
That's incredible. Wow. Well, congratulations. You passed. You made it to the end of the game. You won the game. So what do you think is next for this line of research? Are you thinking about other decades or
so this is actually a pretty huge project. I've collected between 25 and 30 oral histories. There's a few more I'd like to get if I can. I've worked with students to get those transcribed. My student research team has been amazing. But like just transcribing, processing, and coding those has been an enormous task. This is one of the first pieces coming out where I'm actually going back and being like, okay, this person said this, and this person also said this, and this other unrelated person said it. Like that was clearly important, right? And really just spending time looking at these and then also really thinking about that CD-ROM environment, because I'm very interested in how strange what the things produced on CD-ROM at this time were. And I think we forget, right? Because I'm like, oh yeah, Peter Gabriel made a CD-ROM, and someone's like, the who? Right? Like the Peter Gabriel, right? Not like different Peter Gabriel that you're acting like is famous for some reason. It's like, no, that same one. It was that one. So it's an interesting time. I think transitional periods are interesting. So hopefully working on a book about this, and then we'll see what's next after that. But it's a big project and it's going to take a while. So
excellent. I look forward to the book.
Likewise. Certainly, I learned a lot reading the paper. Like I said, it was something that you don't see it wasn't as pervasive in the UK, but you saw some of those games on the shelves, and actually in game stores sometimes in a dedicated corner. So it was kind of interesting to kind of see this really explored in a bit more detail. But yeah, Carly, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been really awesome. Just a reminder for everyone, this is the Sparklier Worlds paper. I don't even need to write the subtitle, but yes, it's Understanding Games for Girls as Style Intervention, and that's part of the criticism and analysis track. So be sure to check that out. This is already after FDG's already occurred, so the talk ran yesterday, so you missed it. That's shame on you, but you can always go back and check the paper. Carly, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you've had a great week at the conference.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. There you go, everyone. By all means, go and check out that paper. Super interesting body of work. It was personally quite interesting to me because also there's a slightly... Actually, Anne, you might be able to speak to this a little bit.
Yes.
We were talking about Gone Home earlier. And one of the things I found really interesting in that conversation was our preconceptions going into it and the experiences you've had in playing video games and how that influences playing Gone Home. I thought Gone Home was a horror game for the first 2/3. I honestly thought, and I think this might have been because I think I played Alien Isolation right before it. And then I'm like, something's going to go wrong. And it wasn't until maybe the closing hour or so, I'm like, no, actually, this is meant to be a really sweet, poignant story about this family and this particular person. But
it did get the creepy vibes though, because it was,
it does.
Yeah.
The art direction's on point.
Absolutely.
First hour or two, I'm just going around every corner like...
You're like, where's the flashlight?
I'm just waiting for all the lights to go out and then something to like PT style to be standing in the hallway. But anyway.
Yeah, maybe a different demographic.
Speaking of creepy people standing in hallways, it's time to have a look at the next episode of Best Paper Watch.
Best segue ever.
That is top-notch content. We're not cutting that. So yeah, in our final segment of Best Paper Watch, Mike is ending his journey in Hyde Park, which is also in London. And he's pondering the history of art and continuing an important Best Paper Watch tradition.
Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Best Paper Watch. Today is the final leg of our journey as we complete our trip from the south coast of England and its beautiful beaches all the way across the countryside through and up to London. We've got just enough time to cover a couple more best papers, and where better place to do it than the Serpentine in London's Hyde Park, a favourite place of artists and scientists throughout history, and that's very appropriate because the two best papers I want to talk to you about today are very much concerned with history. The sincerest form of flattery, large-scale analysis of code reuse in Atari 2600 games. So yesterday on Best Paper Watch, when we discussed Elden Ring and archaeology, we talked about the ephemerality of gaming history and the difficulty in recording it. And this paper is a great example of another bunch of artists/authors trying to do exactly that. And in particular, they're looking at the culture around programming the Atari 2600, which was not just obviously a landmark games console, but a really interesting period in the history of technology where documentation was scarce, competition was fierce, the internet didn't exist, we couldn't just go on GitHub and Stack Overflow looking for answers. And so analysing code bases gives us a really interesting insight into the way programmers interacted with one another, how they tried to solve problems, and the broader social context even around that. And one of the really fascinating things that hits you when you read this paper is how effortlessly it mixes the deeply technical analysis of Atari 2600 games and the social, cultural context surrounding the people that made these games. One of the authors was previously an employee of a company that worked on Atari 2600 games, and they share some of their insights from their period working with this company. And this is coupled with a really elegant analysis of code bases themselves and a fascinating methodology about what it means for a section of code to be reused somewhere else. And I think it's this delicate balance of all of these interesting topics that makes this paper so unique. It's a technical paper, it's about computer science and hardware and programming, but it's also a social studies paper. It's about the cultural context and the history. And that blend of things is very FDG to me. It's a really amazing paper to be ending this week sharing with you. As you can see, I've managed to get a little bit closer to the beautiful waters of the Serpentine with my pastel so I can finish off this work. But before I do, let me tell you about one more best paper. It's called Privileging the Past. So this paper seeks to dive into the culture of retro gaming on YouTube and Twitch. Now, retro gaming is obviously the coverage of periods of games history that have now become older and perhaps fallen out of the living memory of gaming's youngest participants. So retro gaming covers things like the Atari 2600 that we discovered today, but to perhaps the shock and horror of people of a certain age in the FDG audience, it includes things like the PlayStation 1, maybe even the PlayStation 2 in some cases, and the PlayStation 3 is looking pretty close to retro in some cases as well. Jokes about how old we feel aside, this is a huge part of gaming history, and one of the purposes of retro gaming on YouTube and Twitch is to tell the story of that period of history to a group of people who maybe weren't alive to have memories of it themselves. And this paper asks what kind of story they're being told, how that story is being told, and who's getting to tell it. And what it finds, as the title suggests, is that there's a certain type of privilege associated with the type of people who have become famous for telling these stories, but also maybe a kind of ignorance in the way in which the story is being told. So, for example, there's a lot of stories about being an underdog or being excluded from certain groups or experiences as people kind of recollect being young and playing these games. But as the paper points out, what it doesn't acknowledge is the people who were excluded even from the games communities then and are still being excluded from them today. And the retelling of this history is again repeating those exclusionary patterns and maybe keeping people out of enjoying this space. It's a really thought-provoking paper, and I'm kind of glad that we're ending the week on it. Online communities move, culture changes very rapidly. Tomorrow's retro gaming even won't be the same as today's. And so having an analysis of what that looks like right now is super, super valuable, and the stories that it tells and the problems that it highlights are really relevant and interesting. Well, I'm afraid that's it for this year. Those are all of the best papers we have at FDG. Thank you so much for joining me this week. I've really enjoyed taking you on another tour. Hopefully we'll be back next year in 2023 with more best papers. But until then, I've managed to secure my traditional end of best paper watch pastry. And although I can't be with you all in person once again this year, I'm with you in spirit. So cheers, and here's to another year of best papers.
Thanks very much, Mike, for a wonderful end to Best Paper Watch. As you can imagine, given it was in the centre of London, that beer and croissant were incredibly expensive. But please let it be known that, as always, we spare no expense for our beloved audience here at FDG
Absolutely.
TV. And of course, for our beloved guests. So please welcome our next guest for today. This is Pejman Mirza-Babaei, who is an associate professor at Ontario Tech University and presented a paper that was on Tuesday, I believe that was presented in the AI track. This is Charting the Uncharted with GUR, how AI playtesting can supplement expert evaluation. Pejman, welcome to FDG TV.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Super excited to do this interview.
Yes. So with your paper, you describe a study with game developers and games user research specialists on the use and usefulness of AI-assisted pathfinding and simulation tools. And that tool is PathOS in order to ascertain issues with level design. So we were hoping you could talk to us a little bit about the motivation for your work and what did you want to accomplish, and do you think you managed it? That sounded much harsher than I meant it, by the
way. I give you a bit of a background on why we did this work. I think a couple of years ago, I got to work at a kind of an indie dev incubator named Execution Labs in Montreal. So what we did there was to support indie studios with both funding, so we kind of give them some cash, but also expertise. So there were a group of people who helped them with like a design, production, community management, analytics, and my role was to help them with user research. And then through those basically years that I was involved with that program, I got to kind of learn more about the kind of indie development culture and needs. And since then, my research kind of shifted towards providing methods and tools to make user research more accessible for smaller studios, let's say. So the idea of PathOS kind of happened a few years ago. I had a really bright, clever student named Samantha, and I tried to convince her to do a master's. And she really loved like programming, and I'm doing like user research, which is not really maybe sometimes related. So I told her that, look, let's find something together. And she was like, oh, I want to do something with AI. And then, and I was thinking, but it has to kind of be relevant to user research. So we came up with this idea of AI-based playtesting, and that's where the PathOS basically tool born. So it was through her initial research. And that's a paper that we published a couple of years ago, with the intention of using AI as a way to try to find, to run playtests and find issues early on in development where it's easier to fix them. Through that initial studies, we realized that the tool could also be helpful for user researchers themselves. And the reason that's important is because in user research, we usually need to analyze and collect loads of data, which is probably one of the hardest parts, because we need to rely on human players, humans, like getting them to the lab. It's not that easy. Then you need to also make sure you kind of cover a wide kind of different type of plays and things like that. So one technique that we use in user research, we call it expert evaluation, which usually relies on experts looking at games and analyze them. But those expert evaluations don't usually use real player data. So they are very subjective. And then, so the idea for this work that we have presented at FDG was to use the PathOS tool to generate this simulated data that can be used by expert evaluation. So not only they're gonna kind of make decision and judgment based on what they see in the game, but they have access to this simulated player data to kind of maybe justify some of their design, some of their thoughts. So that's the kind of a motivation behind this tool. If it's achieved, if we manage to achieve our motivation or goal, that's kind of an interesting part. Like it depends on where we see it. Like if it's the sense of like having a students writing a thesis on it and publish it, yes. In the sense of if people are using it in the industry, the original PathOS tool, we made it as an open access, basically code available. We know a couple of studios that are using it. Same as the PathOS Plus, so the work that we presented here, it's also open access and available. I don't know if anyone using it these days, but I know the original PathOS, some companies using it. So I hope that it's at least going towards kind of achieving that goal that we have.
I mean,
I was just
Anne,
going to say,
go ahead.
It sounds like a success to me personally. So
yeah, like anytime you've got academic research like this, which is subsequently then moving across into industry and people are actually using it, that already speaks volumes, I think. So fantastic job there. Well, I was interested looking at the paper, because one of the things that you do as part of the study is you looked at popular, often infamous, problematic levels in existing games, and then what you did was you recreated them like sort of like kind of grey boxed them out in Unity and allowed people to play through those level designs again. What pushed you to explore these broken levels, these kind of, you know, less critically acclaimed levels in the first place, and why specifically those levels that you ended up picking? Because some of them were from like popular shooters like Far Cry, for example.
Yeah, that's a good point that you brought up. So there are lots of consideration going on into a study design, as you know, when we make a tool, and we are basically trying to balance a couple of different needs at the same time. So in a way, we had to figure out something that it fits into a master thesis timeframe. We also wanted to kind of expose our participants to. We wanted kind of a games or prototype that has some, let's say, known issues, so that they could use to identify them through expert evaluation. Obviously, we didn't have access to those original game. So we had to kind of recreate them. Our tool is work on Unity, so we needed to kind of try to recreate them in Unity. Then there is we wondered a little bit, like, should we just create some games ourselves and then try to have some issues in them, or should we go with something that it's a little bit more known in terms of having some existing, like, let's say, usability like issues. And it's like arguable, obviously, which approach might be better or not. What we ended up doing was to go with with what we did, basically. So we recreated those levels, and then we wanted to see if our, let's call them expert evaluators, using PathOS Plus can identify those issues or not. Obviously, then we may have introduced some biases, so kind of know of them. Like, even in those recreations, sometimes, probably not one or two of them, we were not able to like capture the feeling of the sense of that original design carefully, which was expected. But on the other side, we could still use them to assess how these expert evaluators, these participants, use the tool and what sort of feedback they could provide for us.
Yeah, that makes that makes a lot of sense. You want to test it on the environment that it will be used in, for sure. So speaking of that, in the tool you use individual AI agents that play through the level, and the type of user testing I've seen a lot of has kind of summarized that data as heat maps, etc. And I'm curious, in your research and in the project, what benefits did you find when you were looking at those moment-to-moment AI decisions, as opposed to looking at a more summarized view?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing that, one of the challenges with playtesting, as I mentioned, is kind of covering usually a wide, let's say, spectrum of players with different personality or different behavior. You may have a player who wants to finish the level as soon as possible, and you may have a player who wants to explore everything in the level. There might be another player that wants to collect all the collectible and kill all the enemies or whatever. So these players usually perform different type of behavior when they are playing game. So when we look at kind of aggregated data through visualization, it might be harder to kind of see how these individual players with this individual behavior go through the level. One cool thing that our tool, I would say, enable us to do, it's, first of all, it's very basic. Like we call it AI, but it's a very basic heuristic based kind of decision making. So it's not like you're not using any form of like machine learning or things like that. So what we could do, we could basically customize these agent and then tell them how to behave in a level, and then watch them do that, and then see how they interact with different objects in the level. So while yes, there is loads of benefits in seeing those aggregated visualization, at least our participants commented that sometimes they wanted to watch these individual player that they customize, for example, for finishing that level as soon as possible. They wanted to see how that one player or one group of players with that type of behavior go through the level. So I would say there are benefits in both type of visualization, depending on what sort of research questions you are trying to answer.
I guess building off of that a little bit is that, like you said, you've had to customize the bot to suit the games that you were testing on. So what kinds of games right now does the PathOS tool really work well towards, and which, are there any others that maybe it's not quite there yet, but with a little bit of extra work, you think it would suit quite nicely?
Yeah. So one thing I should highlight, I guess, probably very similar to many other of kind of tools that are built in academic context. So our tool is a prototype, just kind of proving that such a tool can exist within a specific, area that we could kind of test it with that scope. So for this current work, so it's based on Unity. We are looking at the moment on games that have kind of you have players going through kind of levels, and they need to explore a level. So kind of that sort of game. But again, the main intention is to prove that such a thing could be useful. And as I said, I know a couple of studios, like commercial studios, who took the code and adopted it for their own needs, or their own games. We don't know much detail about it. We just kind of got some like nice emails say, hey, thank you so much, we use this tool, this is awesome. So this, like, we got some of those feedback, but so I assume that there is a way to adopt it. Again, our focus was a small prototype to proof of concept, but again, everything we've done is open source. Our codes, we have manuals and stuff like that for people to like, again, our hope is to make this accessible for people, developers to use.
That's fantastic. I just wanted to echo Tommy that anytime you have industry using your tools from academia, it's such a huge win. So that must be really cool feeling. I wouldn't know. No, anyway, moving on. So, you have people using this tool, which is phenomenal. Do you also see this as something that could possibly complement human playtesting? And, how would you see that possibly working?
Yeah, I love that question. So the reason I like this question a lot is because so playtesting kind of, or usability playtesting, let's call it that, because there are many different types of playtesting out there. So usability playtesting often happens towards later in development process because in order to get human player experience the game, you need a close to finish experience. You need the audio to be there. You need the graphics to be there. You need the code to work properly, because if it crashes a few times, people not gonna like it anymore. They're gonna like bias their experience. For all those reasons, usability playtesting happens later on in development, and at that stage, usually changing things is quite expensive and time consuming when it's getting closer to release. In compared to that, if we are able to do this AI-based playtesting, it can happen much earlier in development when everything's still at the prototype stage. Like the AI probably not gonna care much if there's a music or not, if the graphics are polished nicely or not. So, and that's kind of the cool thing, because we can have a level, like in our development, we have a basic level. We just tag different objects. So it's just a box that we tag it as, this is a tree. And then we have a circle that's, okay, this is one enemy, and this is how that enemy behave. And still the AI agents perceived it as an enemy, and then they can interact with it. So for those reasons, such tools can have application earlier in development, where making those iteration and changes are going to be much easier. The other aspect is that recruiting players and bringing them to the lab, compensating them. This is like lengthy and expensive process, where that basically means the number of iteration we do with real human is usually limited, and we know that, at least we assume that more iteration usually lead to a better game quality. So having a tool that allows a developer to iterate more often, especially early on in development, I think it would contribute a lot. but we are not trying to argue that our tool or any AI tool gonna separate human testing, because again, there are many aspects that we cannot test. What we are basically saying is maybe such tools can have application early on, try to reduce or improve the quality as much as possible. So when we get to like a human playtesting, the researcher can focus on more complex issues that is only identified through those playtesting, rather than figuring out that, oh my God, the level is complex. There is like it's difficult to navigate at that stage. So yeah, that's
Right.
basically everything that such tool can have contribution.
Yeah, that it makes sense to, a lot of times with the AI tools, what we want to do is replace the part of the work that people may not want to do because it's not very creative. And this seems like a great example of that, where you can bring in the players when it's at a point that is more enjoyable and more useful for playtesters, human playtesters. Awesome.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Pejman, for joining us. This has been a really interesting conversation to have, but also I just want to remind everyone that the paper was Charting the Uncharted with GUR, How AI Playtesting Can Supplement Expert Evaluation. You've already missed the talk, so shame on you, but you get plenty of opportunity to go ahead and read the paper as well. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you've had a good week at the conference and enjoy your weekend, I guess. How do you end this conversation? Like, 2 weeks in advance of when it's supposed to air? I don't know.
Enjoy your trip.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. And yeah, this wasn't obviously my own work. It's a group of work. So like Atiyah, who led the work, and then Raquel and Stevie, who also helped with the paper. I should kind of mention them as well.
Absolutely.
All
right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Awesome.
But yeah, that's another fantastic conversation for our last interview today. Always interesting to hear more about AI playtesting, particularly at the moment as automated testing of various forms is continuing to grow in prominence, I think, in the industry. And yeah, I'm kind of excited to see a little bit more of that, particularly as the AI guy, I guess, on the hosting team. And now our hosting team has increased, I see.
Yes, I've brought on all of our co-hosts from this week. So we've got Zoe, who's like, why are we doing this? And then Kaylee actually moved briefly.
Yep. I hope you caught it. I didn't. I just saw it in our production chat. Just someone went, the cat moved. Like, what?
Two cats. They do exist.
They do exist. See. So yeah, this is us. We're rapidly approaching the end of this episode, and so I guess. And what's happening tomorrow at FDG?
Well, Tommy, so tomorrow we have nothing, absolutely nothing, because the conference is over. So please go outside, touch some grass, enjoy some sights. Even if you're not actually in Greece, I'm sure there's some cool things to see at your own house. So please enjoy and enjoy your weekend.
Such a passive-aggressive comment towards a lot of computing-based researchers. Go touch some grass.
Go pet your animals.
Antonius wrote that, didn't he?
Yes, of course.
But of course, FDG will return. In fact, FDG 2023 has already been announced. It'll be happening April 12th to 14th next year in Lisbon. That's Portugal. And the call for papers is already out. In fact, it's November 4th. So you've only got, about just under 2 months at the point this airs. So
when you go to FDG this year and you have all those great ideas, write them down and then turn them into papers. And then we'll see you at FDG 2023.
Speaking of FDG 2023 and beyond, or at least speaking of seeing us again, FDG TV, what are we doing next?
So apparently we're going to do a live show at some point during FDG, and in which we will be showing some of the images that people submitted for the community challenge, as well as answering questions that people might have for us. And
we'll probably have the gag reel as well, because there's a lot of material this year. We made
it'll actually be just a 2-hour long blooper reel, and then that's it. That's actually the
Not-
life part.
It's not
It's just
far off it, to be honest. I'm slapping all this together at the moment. Like, we just need to cut out that 20 minutes there, and we'll. We actually spend 8 hours recording a 1 hour show.
yes. So putting together the gag reel actually is more work than putting together the show.
More fun too.
Apparently, it's going to happen Friday at the same time. So
As
tomorrow,
this.
same time as this. Come
Same-
join us live, where Tommy will actually be able to respond to you real time based on what you're doing in the chat.
I'm just
So
not
all
going
these-
to do it out of spite, though.
Yeah. I will respond to you, and
No,
we
I'll
will
respond,
mock Tommy
I'll
together.
I'll respond. Yeah, I mean, Anne's entire energy and being part of this is because she's good at just harassing me, really. And yeah, we make a good pairing. So hang on, what's the second take?
Where we don't say that there's anything tomorrow at FDG TV.
Okay.
So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Tommy Thompson, our host.
Special thank you, of course, to our guests for today, Carly and Pejman. Thank you to Mike for continuing to, fight the good fight, finding all those best papers out there in the deepest, darkest corners of London. Thank you to Antonius for just generally driving us insane over the last 4 days. And a thank you to all of you for continuing to support this nonsense.
Yes. And of course, thank you to Kaylee and Zoe.
And to Kaylee and Zoe. Can't believe I almost forgot that. Awkward.